September 12, 1944. The forests of eastern France still smoldered from the previous day's engagement. Wehrmacht Captain Heinrich Weber stood in a muddy clearing, staring at something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Before him sat an American M4 Sherman tank, nearly intact, abandoned by its crew during a hasty retreat. The morning mist clung to its angular hull like a shroud, and Weber felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine despite the warm autumn air. Weber was not a combat officer. He was an engineer, a specialist in armored vehicle design who had spent the pre-war years working for Daimler-Benz. The Wehrmacht had pulled him from the Kummersdorf proving grounds 3 days earlier with urgent orders to examine any captured American armor and report his findings directly to the Reich Ministry of Armaments. Now, as he walked slowly around the Sherman, his trained eyes already noticing details that troubled him deeply, he understood why. Berlin wanted this information so badly. They were afraid of what men like him might discover. His assistant, Lieutenant Franz Kohler, a younger engineer who had graduated from the Technical University of Berlin just before the war, stood beside the tank with a notebook already open. Franz was 26 years old, brilliant with mathematics, and still possessed the idealistic certainty that German engineering superiority would ultimately prevail. Weber had once shared that certainty. That was before he had started paying attention to the reports from the Eastern Front, before he had seen the industrial capacity charts that crossed his desk. Before this moment, the Sherman sat at an odd angle, one track blown off by what appeared to be a Panzerfaust hit to the running gear, but the tank itself remained structurally sound. Its crew had escaped, leaving behind personal items scattered in their haste. A photograph of a smiling woman and 2 children lay in the mud near the open hatch. Weber picked it up carefully, wiping the dirt away with his thumb. The American soldier who had operated this machine had a family waiting for him. Just like Weber's own family waited in Stuttgart, just like Franz's young wife waited in Berlin. Weber pocketed the photograph, telling himself he would find a way to return it someday, knowing even as he thought it that such gestures belonged to a different kind of war, perhaps to a different world entirely. He turned his attention back to the tank, running his hand along the welded hull. The metal felt different under his fingers, not thicker, not stronger in any dramatic way, but different in a manner he could not yet articulate. It would take hours of detailed examination to understand what his instincts were already trying to tell him. Franz called out measurements as he climbed onto the hull, his voice carrying the excitement of an engineer encountering a rival's work. Weber listened with half his attention, while the other half remained focused on the welds, the casting marks, the evidence of mass production that covered every surface of this American war machine. He had examined captured Soviet tanks before. They were crude but effective, built with the desperate efficiency of a nation fighting for survival. This Sherman was something entirely different. It spoke of a nation that was not desperate at all. Weber climbed through the commander's hatch, lowering himself into the turret with practiced ease. The interior smelled of oil, cordite, and something else he could not immediately identify. Coffee, perhaps, or the sweet scent of American cigarettes. The space was cramped but organized in ways that immediately struck him as deliberate. Every control, every instrument, every piece of equipment had been positioned with an operator in mind rather than simply fitted into available space. Franz followed him inside, squeezing past the gun breech to examine the driver's compartment. For several minutes, neither man spoke. They simply looked, touched, and began to understand. Weber's hands moved over the controls, noting their simplicity, their accessibility. The instruments were clearly labeled in English, but even without understanding every word, their function was obvious. This was a tank designed to be operated by men with minimal training, by soldiers who might have been farmers or factory workers mere months before climbing into this machine. The radio equipment caught Weber's attention next. It was installed as standard equipment, not as an afterthought or a luxury reserved for command vehicles. Every Sherman, he realized, could communicate with every other Sherman. He thought of the German tanks he had worked on, where radio equipment was often limited to platoon and company commanders, where ordinary tank crews relied on hand signals and flags. The implications began to settle in his mind, like stones dropping into still water, each one sending ripples of understanding outward. Franz emerged from the driver's position, his face troubled. "Captain, the controls are extraordinarily simple. The transmission, it is not like ours at all." Weber nodded slowly. He had already noticed the same thing. German tanks used sophisticated manual transmissions that required skilled drivers, men who understood the mechanical sympathy needed to shift gears properly under combat conditions. The Sherman used something different, something that looked almost crude in its simplicity but was actually brilliant in its practicality. Weber pulled out his own notebook and began sketching details, his pencil moving quickly across the page. He drew the turret basket, the ammunition storage, the engine access panels. Each sketch was accompanied by notes written in his careful engineer's hand. Beside technical observations, he found himself writing questions that had nothing to do with engineering specifications. How many of these can they build? How quickly? How many men can they train to operate them? The external examination continued as afternoon light filtered through the forest canopy. Franz measured armor thickness at various points, while Weber studied the tracks, the suspension, the engine compartment. The Ford engine surprised him. It was simple, reliable, almost agricultural in its straightforward design. German tanks used powerful, sophisticated engines that required constant maintenance and skilled mechanics. This American engine looked like something that could be repaired by any mechanic who had ever worked on a truck or tractor. Weber stood back, looking at the complete picture the Sherman presented. It was not an engineering masterpiece. It was something potentially more dangerous. It was industrial warfare made manifest. That evening, Weber and Franz worked by lamplight in a commandeered farmhouse 2 kilometers from where the Sherman sat. Maps and technical drawings covered the wooden table between them, but Weber found himself staring at his notes, without really seeing them. His mind kept returning to a single, overwhelming thought that he had been trying to suppress since the moment he first touched the American tank. Germany was going to lose this war. Franz spoke quietly, breaking the silence. "The welds, Captain. They are not as refined as ours, but they are consistent. Every weld joint shows the same technique, the same quality." Weber nodded, understanding what his assistant was really saying. These tanks were not being built by master craftsmen in small workshops. They were being assembled on production lines by workers who had been trained to perform specific tasks repeatedly, efficiently, endlessly. Weber had visited German tank factories. He had seen the careful, almost artistic way that skilled metalworkers crafted each vehicle. German tanks were magnificent machines, over-engineered perhaps, but representing the pinnacle of European industrial craftsmanship. Each Panther or Tiger required thousands of man-hours to complete, with components machined to exacting tolerances by experienced workers. The Sherman represented a completely different philosophy. It was designed not to be perfect, but to be good enough, and to be built in quantities that would overwhelm any qualitative advantage German armor might possess. He walked to the window, looking out at the darkened French countryside. Somewhere beyond the horizon, American factories were running 3 shifts per day, producing Shermans by the hundreds. Young American workers, many of them women, were riveting hulls and installing engines with the same efficiency their parents had used to build automobiles before the war. Germany's factories, meanwhile, were being bombed into rubble. The skilled workers who remained were exhausted, malnourished, working with increasingly scarce materials. Franz joined him at the window. "Sir, the maintenance accessibility, I could remove and replace the engine in this Sherman in a matter of hours with a trained crew. Our Tigers require days for the same operation." Weber closed his eyes. Another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Another realization he would have to include in his report. The Americans had not just built a tank that could be mass-produced. They had built a tank that could be maintained in the field by ordinary soldiers, that could be repaired quickly and returned to combat. The mathematics were becoming inescapable. Even if a single German Panther could destroy 3 or 4 Shermans in combat, and Weber was no longer certain even that ratio would hold true, the Americans could simply build more Shermans. They could afford the losses. Germany could not. Every German tank lost represented irreplaceable resources, irreplaceable skilled labor, irreplaceable time that Germany no longer had. Weber returned to the table and picked up his pen. He began writing the introduction to his report, choosing his words carefully. The truth he had discovered needed to be told, but he wondered if anyone in Berlin would truly listen, or if they would simply file his report away with all the other unwelcome truths. The following morning brought rain, but Weber and Franz returned to the Sherman with renewed purpose. Today they would conduct detailed measurements and comparisons with the German tanks Weber knew intimately. He had brought technical specifications for the Panther and Tiger with him, classified documents that painted a picture of German engineering ambition. Now, standing beside the American tank in the cold drizzle, those specifications felt like artifacts from a different era. Franz began with armor measurements, using calipers to determine exact thickness at various points on the hull and turret. The Sherman's frontal armor measured 51 mm at most positions, significantly thinner than the Panther's 80 mm or the Tiger's 100 mm. On paper, this represented a clear German advantage. In reality, Weber knew it meant the Sherman could be built with less steel, less weight, and less strain on an already overtaxed manufacturing base. The gun was next. The Sherman mounted a 75 mm weapon, adequate for most purposes, but inferior to the Panther's long-barreled 75 mm or the Tiger's fearsome 88 mm gun. Weber examined the American gun's mounting, noting its reliability-focused design. The hydraulic traverse mechanism was simpler than German equivalents, less sophisticated but less prone to failure. Again, the pattern repeated itself. Good enough, not perfect. Reliable, not revolutionary. Weber climbed onto the engine deck and opened the access panels. The engine compartment revealed the Sherman's philosophy in its purest form. The radial aircraft engine, or in some variants the multibank engine assembly, could be removed as a complete unit. No need to disassemble half the tank to reach critical components. No specialized tools required beyond what any maintenance crew would carry. He thought of the Maybach engines in German tanks, magnificent pieces of engineering that required elaborate procedures for even minor repairs. Franz called up from ground level. "Captain, the track design. It is wider than our standard, better ground pressure distribution. Another small advantage multiplied across thousands of tanks." Weber made notes, his handwriting becoming less precise as the rain intensified. The Sherman used a vertical volute spring suspension system, simple and robust. German tanks employed more sophisticated torsion bar systems that performed better but required more maintenance and more skilled crews to repair. Weight became the next consideration. The Sherman weighed approximately 30 tons combat loaded. The Panther weighed 45 tons, the Tiger 56 tons. Those extra tons meant thicker armor and bigger guns, but they also meant more fuel consumption, more strain on transmissions, more wear on every component. They meant bridges that could not support them, roads that could not bear them, and logistics chains stretched to breaking. Weber stood in the rain, water running down his face, and completed his mental calculation. The Sherman was not designed to win individual tank duels. It was designed to win the war through numbers, through reliability, through the inexorable logic of industrial production. The Americans had looked at warfare and asked not how to build the perfect tank, but how to build enough tanks. That question, and its answer, would determine everything. Weber spent the next 3 days gathering every piece of intelligence he could find about American industrial capacity. He interviewed captured American tank crews, studied reports from German intelligence services, and reviewed production estimates that had been dismissed as enemy propaganda. The numbers he compiled told a story that made his engineering analysis of the Sherman suddenly, terrifyingly relevant. In 1943 alone, American factories had produced approximately 29,000 tanks. Weber read that figure 3 times, certain it must be an error. Franz, sitting across from him in the farmhouse, had gone pale when Weber shared the information. "Sir, that cannot be correct. Our total production last year was less than 12,000 vehicles, and that included all armored fighting vehicles, not just tanks." Weber pulled out another document, this one captured from an American supply officer. The projections for 1944 suggested production would remain at similar levels or increase. Meanwhile, German production was declining despite desperate efforts to increase output. Allied bombing campaigns were systematically destroying factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks. The skilled workers who might have maintained production rates were either dead, conscripted into combat units, or working under conditions that made consistent quality impossible. He began calculating ratios, filling page after page with figures that grew more damning with each equation. If American factories could produce 3 Shermans for every Panther Germany built, and if each Sherman required 1/3 the maintenance hours, and if American logistics could keep those Shermans supplied with fuel and ammunition while German supply lines collapsed, then the mathematical outcome was inevitable. Germany could not win a war of attrition against such industrial capacity. Franz attempted to find optimism in tactical considerations. But Captain, our tanks are superior in combat. A well-positioned Panther can destroy multiple Shermans. Weber looked at his young assistant with something approaching pity. He had believed the same thing himself just days ago. Yes, Franz, in ideal conditions, with experienced crews, with adequate ammunition and fuel, with maintenance support, our tanks perform admirably. Now tell me how many of those conditions we can still guarantee. The silence that followed was answer enough. Weber continued his analysis, now calculating the broader industrial picture. American factories produced not just tanks, but trucks, half-tracks, jeeps, and artillery in numbers that dwarfed German production. More importantly, American industry operated beyond the reach of enemy bombers, with access to unlimited raw materials and a workforce that was well-fed, well-rested, and motivated by something other than fear and desperation. Weber thought about the Ford River Rouge plant in Michigan, a facility he had toured before the war during a technical exchange program. That single factory complex could produce more vehicles in a month than some entire German manufacturing regions. He had admired American industrial methods then, seeing them as interesting but somewhat crude compared to German precision. Now he understood that precision without capacity was merely an expensive way to lose. The report he was writing had evolved from a technical assessment into something much darker, a mathematical proof of Germany's defeat, written in production figures and maintenance hours. Weber sat alone in the farmhouse late into the night, a blank sheet of paper before him and a pen in his hand. He had been trying to write to his wife, Anna, for over an hour. The words would not come, not the ones he wanted to write, not the truth he had discovered. The letters he could send would pass through military censors who would redact anything that might damage morale. The letter he wanted to write could never be sent at all. "Dear Anna," he finally wrote, then stopped. How could he tell her that he had just spent a week examining the instrument of their country's defeat? How could he explain that he had looked at an American tank and seen not just a machine, but the future written in steel and rivets? She was in Stuttgart with their 2 daughters, living in a city that Allied bombers visited with increasing frequency. She needed hope, not the crushing certainty that her husband had acquired in a muddy French forest. Franz was writing his own letter across the room, his pen moving more freely than Weber's. The young engineer still possessed some measure of hope, or perhaps he simply lacked the imagination to fully grasp what their findings meant. Weber envied him that ignorance, that ability to compartmentalize the personal from the professional. Franz could write to his young bride about missing her cooking, about looking forward to their reunion, about plans for after the war. Weber could no longer think about after the war without confronting what that aftermath would look like. He tried again. "The work here is challenging but important. I think of you and the girls constantly." Every word felt like a betrayal of what he truly wanted to say. He wanted to tell Anna to take the girls and flee, to go south to Switzerland, to find some way out of Germany before the inevitable collapse. But such suggestions would be treasonous, would endanger her more than remaining in Stuttgart. He was trapped between his duty as a husband and his duty as an officer, between truth and survival. Weber set down his pen and picked up another document instead, one that would never see official channels. He had been keeping a personal journal, separate from his technical reports, where he recorded his unfiltered thoughts. It was dangerous to keep such a document, but he felt compelled to create some record of what he was experiencing, what he was understanding. Future historians might need to know that some Germans had seen the truth, even as their nation marched toward destruction. Today I calculated how many Shermans the Americans can afford to lose in exchange for each German tank they destroy, he wrote in his journal. The ratio is sustainable for them, catastrophic for us. We are fighting against mathematics itself, and mathematics does not negotiate, does not retreat, does not surrender. It simply is, he thought. About his daughters, 12 and 9 years old. They had been born into a Germany that promised them a 1,000-year Reich, that taught them their nation was destined for greatness. What world would they inherit instead? Weber's final calculations filled an entire notebook. He had reduced modern warfare to equations, and every equation told the same story. The mathematics were elegant in their brutality, offering no room for hope or propaganda, only the cold certainty of industrial reality. He sat with Franz in the farmhouse, the captured Sherman now thoroughly documented, and walked his assistant through the numbers one final time. Franz listened, his expression growing darker with each calculation. Weber began with the most basic figures. American steel production in 1943 had reached approximately 80 million tons. German production, even including occupied territories, had reached only 30 million tons. Steel was the foundation of everything. Tanks, ships, aircraft, ammunition, all required steel. The Americans possessed nearly 3 times Germany's capacity, and that gap was widening. But raw materials told only part of the story. Weber moved to production efficiency. The Sherman they had examined required approximately 10,000 man-hours to produce, based on his analysis and intelligence reports. A Panther required 55,000 man-hours. A Tiger required 300,000 man-hours. Franz did the calculation himself, his pencil moving frantically across paper. "Captain, that means for every Tiger we produce, the Americans could build 30 Shermans." The implications cascaded outward. Those 30 Shermans would require 30 crews, yes, but America had a population of 130 million people compared to Germany's 70 million, and the Americans were not fighting a two-front war against opponents who outnumbered them. The Soviets were producing their own tanks in numbers that rivaled American output. Germany faced an ocean of armor from both east and west. Weber continued relentlessly through his calculations. Fuel consumption per kilometer traveled. Maintenance hours required per 100 kilometers of operation. Spare parts production rates. Training time for crew members. Every metric favored the Americans. Not because any individual Sherman was superior to German tanks, but because the Sherman was designed as part of a system, an integrated approach to industrial warfare that Germany had never fully grasped. Franz attempted one final argument. But our tactical doctrine, our crew training, surely these factors create advantages that numbers cannot measure. Weber had anticipated this objection. He pulled out casualty reports from recent engagements. Even when German tanks achieved favorable kill ratios, even when Panther and Tiger crews performed brilliantly, the Americans simply replaced their losses and continued advancing. German losses, meanwhile, were increasingly irreplaceable. The young engineer stared at the numbers spread before them, and Weber watched as understanding finally penetrated. Franz's hands trembled slightly as he set down his pencil. "We cannot win," he said quietly. It was not a question. Weber shook his head. "We cannot win. We probably could not have won from the moment America entered the war. Perhaps not even before that. We were fighting against an industrial capacity that we could never match." The silence that followed was heavy, with implications neither man wanted to voice. If the war was mathematically unwinnable, then every soldier dying on the front lines was dying for nothing. Every city being bombed was being destroyed in service of a lost cause. The question of what to do with their findings consumed Weber for days. His technical report was complete, meticulously documented, and professionally presented. It contained all the specifications, measurements, and observations that Berlin had requested, but it also contained conclusions that Weber knew would be unwelcome, perhaps even dangerous. The truth had a way of becoming treasonous when it contradicted official narratives. Franz urged caution. "Captain, perhaps we should soften some of the language in the summary. The technical data speaks for itself, but the strategic implications, maybe those should be less explicit." Weber understood his assistant's concern. Officers had been executed for defeatism, for expressing doubts about final victory. His report, with its cold mathematical assessment of Germany's industrial inadequacy, could easily be interpreted as undermining morale and fighting spirit. Yet Weber felt a responsibility that transcended his own safety. Men were dying every day based on strategies that assumed German qualitative superiority could overcome Allied quantitative advantages. That assumption, his research had proven, was fundamentally flawed. If his report could influence even one decision, could prevent even one pointless offensive or hopeless defense, then the risk of speaking truth might be worthwhile. But he was not naive enough to believe that truth alone would change anything. He thought about the officers and officials who would read his report. Some would dismiss it as the pessimistic conclusions of an engineer who did not understand the warrior spirit. Others would recognize the truth but suppress it rather than face the consequences of acting on such knowledge. A few might actually listen, might actually try to use his findings to make more realistic strategic decisions. But how many divisions would that save? How many lives? Weber made his decision during a sleepless night, listening to distant artillery fire. He would submit the complete report, unaltered and uncompromising, but he would also create copies, unofficial documents that he would entrust to people he believed might survive the war. Perhaps future generations would need to understand not just what happened, but what some Germans had known while it was happening. Perhaps someone needed to document that not everyone had been blind to the truth. Franz discovered him making the copies. "Sir, that is extraordinarily dangerous. If those documents are found..." Weber cut him off gently. "Franz, go back to bed. You know nothing about these copies. When they ask you, and they will ask you if things go badly, you will tell them truthfully that I acted without your knowledge or consent." The younger man's face showed conflict between loyalty and fear. Weber sympathized. Franz had a young wife, a future to protect. Weber, at 43 years old with daughters who would need their mother more than their father in the coming years, felt a different calculus of risk. The official report was submitted through channels 3 days later. Weber included every measurement, every calculation, every conclusion. He recommended immediate changes to German tank production strategy, emphasizing reliability and producibility over maximum performance. He suggested that resources being poured into ever heavier tanks should instead focus on producing adequate vehicles in sustainable numbers. Weber's report reached the Reich Ministry of Armaments on September 28, 1944. He received an acknowledgement of receipt but nothing more. No commendation, no questions, no requests for clarification. The silence was somehow more ominous than outright condemnation would have been. His findings had been filed away, he suspected, alongside countless other inconvenient truths that contradicted the official narrative of inevitable German victory. Franz was reassigned 2 weeks later, transferred to a frontline maintenance unit in the east. The orders came without explanation, but Weber understood their meaning. His assistant had been too closely associated with the Sherman report, had been present for conclusions that made certain people uncomfortable. The transfer was not quite a punishment, but it removed Franz from any position where he might spread defeatist observations to other technical personnel. Weber wrote him a brief letter of recommendation, knowing it would do little good, hoping the young engineer would survive what was coming. Weber himself remained at the proving grounds, assigned to evaluate other captured equipment. American half-tracks, British tanks, Soviet artillery pieces. Each examination reinforced the conclusions he had reached with the Sherman. The Allies possessed not just greater quantities, but increasingly sophisticated understanding of how to design weapons for mass production and ease of maintenance. German equipment remained technically impressive, often superior in individual performance metrics, but utterly unsuited for the industrial total war being waged. He continued his unofficial documentation, filling notebooks with observations that would never appear in official reports. He wrote about conversations with returning officers who described the endless columns of American vehicles, the constant air superiority, the sense of fighting against an opponent who could afford to make mistakes and still win through sheer material abundance. These stories confirmed what his calculations had predicted. Germany was drowning in steel produced by factories it could not bomb, transported by ships it could not sink, wielded by soldiers it could not replace. In November, Weber received an unexpected visitor. A colonel from the ministry, someone he had met briefly years before, arrived at the proving grounds, requesting a private conversation. They walked through the facility grounds as autumn leaves fell around them, and the colonel spoke carefully, choosing words that could not be construed as defeatism if reported. "Your Sherman report was very thorough, Captain, very detailed. Some people found it quite informative, even if official policy cannot acknowledge certain conclusions." Weber understood. His report had been read, had been taken seriously by at least some officials, but nothing would change. The machinery of war would continue grinding forward, regardless of mathematical realities or engineering assessments. The colonel confirmed as much without saying so directly. Production priorities have already been established, commitments made, resources allocated. Changing course now would require admitting previous strategies were flawed. Weber nodded. He had expected nothing different. That evening, he wrote another letter he could not send, this time addressed to no one in particular. "I have told them the truth," he wrote. "I have shown them the numbers, the calculations, the inevitable conclusions. They have acknowledged my work and chosen to ignore it. I do not know if this makes me complicit in what follows." The war ended on May 8, 1945, exactly as Weber's calculations had predicted it would. Not in the timing, perhaps, but in the inevitability of the outcome. Germany surrendered, unconditionally, to overwhelming Allied forces whose material superiority had proven exactly as decisive as his examination of a single Sherman tank had suggested it would be. Weber survived, though survival felt less like fortune and more like obligation. He had seen the truth early enough to have warned others, and that knowledge weighed on him. He was captured by American forces in April and spent several months in a prisoner of war camp, ironically near the same proving grounds where he had once worked. His captors, learning of his engineering background, asked him to document his wartime research. Weber provided them with everything, including copies of his Sherman report. American officers read his work with interest, some expressing surprise that German technical personnel had understood their industrial advantages so clearly. One American colonel remarked that if more German leaders had listened to engineers like Weber, they might have sought peace terms before their country was completely destroyed. Franz survived as well, Weber learned months later. The young engineer had been wounded in the east, but recovered in a Soviet camp before eventual repatriation. They exchanged letters in the years that followed, careful correspondence that never directly addressed what they had discovered in that French forest, but circled around it constantly. Franz became a teacher, training a new generation of German engineers. He never worked on military vehicles again. Weber returned to Stuttgart in 1946 to find his home damaged but standing, his family alive but changed by years of fear and privation. His daughters barely recognized him. Anna had aged beyond her years, her face bearing the marks of surviving in a city that had been systematically bombed. She never asked him directly about his war work, perhaps sensing that he carried knowledge he could not easily share. They rebuilt their life in the ruins, as millions of Germans were doing, trying to construct something new from the wreckage of what had been. In 1952, Weber was invited to speak at an engineering conference about wartime tank development. He accepted, though he struggled with what to say. He spoke about technical specifications, about design philosophies, about the importance of integrating manufacturing considerations into military planning. But in the final moments of his presentation, he added something unscripted. "We lost the war in our factories long before we lost it on the battlefield," he told the assembled engineers. We designed magnificent machines that we could not build in adequate numbers, could not maintain in field conditions, could not support with our industrial base. That is a lesson that transcends any particular conflict. The Sherman tank that Weber and Franz had examined was eventually recovered and sent to an American museum. Weber saw a photograph of it years later in a magazine, restored and displayed as an example of American wartime production. He stared at that photograph for a long time, remembering the rainy September day when he had first understood what it represented. Not just a tank, but the future examining the past and finding it wanting.